1 p.m. Mountain Time. This session is called the Basic Business Organization and Succession Planning. It's a legal and policy track offering by Dan Cornelius and Jim Wabindato. Jim is a member of the Little River Band Ottawa and joined the Indian Land Tenure Foundation in early 2014 as a program development officer. In this role, he works on issues related to landowner education and program development. Prior to joining the organization, Wabindato was a realtor in Arizona and Wisconsin, a site manager with the Indian Land Consolidation Office, a realty specialist and a grant writer with the Bad River Band of Chippewa, as well as an economic development director and casino board member for Little River. Wabindato holds a Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Michigan. Dan Cornelius is a member of the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin and has worked as the Intertribal Agriculture Council's Technical Assistant Specialist for the Great Lakes region since April 2011. He has a bachelor's degree from the University of Puget Sound in history and a JD from the University of Wisconsin Law School. Cornelius' work has focused on expanding value-added production, enhanced partnerships and networks, and new market opportunities for tribal agricultural producers. Highlights of his work include the Great Lakes region, comprehensive food summits hosted by each of the 4 states with federally recognized tribes, numerous hands-on workshops, and launch of a mobile farmers market to help highlight native produced food products and support coordinated distribution and marketing. Dan continues to advance these priorities while providing expanded support for cooperative development, farm business planning, and conservation planning at individual and tribal levels. Thank you for joining this session. I'm going to hand it over to our facilitators as you learn more about how Indian families can learn effective ways to stop the continued division of Indian land titles and ensure that Indian lands are controlled and managed by Indian people. Dan?
Thank you, Electa. So I'm going to talk today just about, this is just the very basics of business organization. And we're not going into a ton of detail, into a ton of depth, in large part because going into that level of detail, sometimes it really takes looking at your individual circumstances. But want to use this presentation here to give just some basic background on why is it important to think about how you structure your business. And when I say business, I mean this, we're going to be talking a little bit about nonprofits today as well. And, so the first, I think for me, the first 2 main considerations are you're thinking about your liability, you're thinking about your taxes, and your overall business operations. What are you trying to accomplish? And ultimately, a lot of it connects back to funding, and whether that, if you're a nonprofit, looking at grants, if you are an individual or a group of individuals and producers coming together, maybe looking at forming a cooperative might be an opportunity to help to raise investment, to raise capital, and it could help to improve your overall operations. Now, of course, one of the big challenges that we have of working, working in Indian country is the question of where will you incorporate? And unfortunately, a lot of our tribes today, we don't have the full complement of options and legal infrastructure to support all of these forms of business organization. So if we have any tribal leaders that are tuning in today, one of the things I'd like to encourage you to think about is is enhancing the legal infrastructure that your tribe has. Can that help to support more business, better business, support really the tribal producers and entrepreneurs in your community? I do want to say, please consult tax, accounting, and legal professionals if you have specific questions. This information today is just really looking at the very basic background of these structures. And these structures are in large part established and controlled by the federal government with the IRS tax code. The IRS is going to look at these different forms of organization differently and the tax treatment is going to be different. But these are the basic types of business organization that we're going to be talking about today. And I do want to say, so we are being streamed live to the CVent website, the conference website. So if you have any questions, if you're tuning in live, please go ahead and type those questions in. You're happy to talk about any of those questions. And then the session is being recorded, so some people may be watching at a later date. But again, these are the basic forms of business organization. Starting off, looking at a sole proprietorship. This is going to be your most basic type of business, because if you don't do anything, you're a sole proprietorship. And I think that's an important thing to reference is is generally you don't need to do anything to form a business. You can, most of our farms, most of our ranches, you're a business. You start running some cows, you start growing some vegetables, selling at the farmers market. You're technically a business, and you don't need to do anything in terms of incorporating. The benefit of a sole proprietorship is that it's simple. You don't need to do anything. The drawback is that if something happens, you don't have any liability protection. All of your assets could be taken. And, again, this is where it gets complicated, of depending where you live, of, that may be going through your tribal court, or, if you're living off reservation, it's probably going to be going through a state court. So I did mention before of where you would incorporate, where you're doing business is going to have a huge impact on what laws you need to follow and what the implications are if anything does happen with your business. If you're ranching and running a construction company or running a trucking company, that's an example of where you're probably going to want to think about maybe even dividing those different operations into individual businesses, because that's going to give you a greater legal protection. So I'm going to talk in a second here on some additional strategies of how you can do that. So then the next form of business organization we're going to talk about is partnerships. This would probably be, I don't know if I'd say the second most common, but this is going to be your basic form of organization of when you've got two or more people coming together. How exactly you structure those partnerships, there's a lot of flexibility there. Looking at liability, that liability is going to vary based on what your agreements are and how you're structured. But oftentimes that primary partner is going to have full liability, and then the other partners could be shielded from liability, but that is going to depend a bit on the structure of the organization and what jurisdiction you're in. There is another form of kind of a hybrid of similar to the next form of organization of a LLC. There's limited liability partnerships as well. So again, this is going to vary based on what jurisdiction you're in. Different states are going to have a little bit different laws, and different tribes as well are going to have different options available. And where you would be going, resolving any disputes is going to depend both on where you're incorporated, but then also potentially on where you're doing business and where any sort of an incident may happen. So the limited liability company is one of the I think is really one of the forms of business organization that that people should be taking a look at. The biggest benefit is that you're going to get liability protection. So if something happens, there's a wreck, and and you or one of your employees would be at fault, responsible for that accident, having a limited liability company is going to give you some degree of protection for losing your house, your ranch, everything. But again, this is really looking at how you're structured, how you organize those assets is going to be key. You also can have benefits in terms of taxes with a limited liability company. The most recent tax law had dropped the tax rate for businesses, corporations. So this is going to really depend on your individual circumstances, but that could be one of the potential benefits of taxation. Forming a limited liability company, it can be done. You can be solely owned, or you can have multiple owners. The operating agreement is key. The operating agreement is going to be really that document that guides, who's responsible for what, who has the responsibilities. So that operating agreement really is key. Big question, does your tribe allow for the incorporation of LLCs? A lot of tribes do, but I wouldn't say that universally that, probably not every tribe does. I would encourage, again, if you're a tribal leader, ask that question, does your tribe allow for the incorporation of LLCs? And if not, I'd recommend looking at working with your attorneys and working with with other support professionals to consider adding on to your tribal legal infrastructure to allow for incorporation of these legal entities. And because the benefit is that probably a lot of tribal members may be more likely to incorporate with the tribe versus needing to go and incorporate with the state. And the more that you have tribal businesses going and incorporating with the state versus with the tribe, I think you really have erosion of tribal sovereignty with the more that you'd have that happening, especially for business that's occurring on the reservation. So again, the basics of an LLC is giving that liability protection, but then you may also have those tax benefits, and you can have multiple LLCs incorporated to be covering different elements of your businesses. If you have that type of a complex operations where you may be involved in different types of activities. I had spent some time back when I was in law school. I had worked for Ho-Chunk Incorporated, the Tribal Development Corporation for Winnebago Tribe in Nebraska. And Ho-Chunk Incorporated has a bunch of different companies and entities that are underneath it. And each one of those individual companies is going to be focusing on a particular aspect of the overall business operations, and they're organized all within that umbrella of that larger Ho-Chunk Incorporated. That's a more complex example, but looking at our farmers and ranchers, if you are engaged in different types of businesses, it generally to incorporate an LLC or any business, usually pretty simple. It just takes filing some paperwork. The other thing, though, that I want to mention is that you are going to really need to be thinking about insurance, and then where are you going to be having your insurance policy, and potentially the more companies that you may have, you may need to be having each one of them insured separately. So that would be a drawback of incorporating multiple different entities. But that, again, is something that you're going to want to really think about and talk about with your tax legal professionals and insurance agents. And another form of business organization is cooperatives. And we had developed a guide to reservation cooperative development. Actually, I think the first version of the Intertribal Ag Council's Guide to Reservation Cooperative Development I believe came out in around 2000 or 2001. About 20 years ago, we updated that guide, and did, really started off and did a whole new guide a couple of years ago. And we do have that is available on the IAC or e-learning platform on Mighty Networks. And one of the great things with that guide is that we have a step-by-step are, if you're going to form a cooperative, what steps do you need to take? The steps that you need to take to form a cooperative are going to be a lot of the similar steps that you would take if you're going to be forming a nonprofit or another form of business, of business organization. So a lot of it is pretty basic, but starting off of, of what's your mission? What are you trying to accomplish? In the case of a cooperative, it's not just one single business. You're going to have multiple businesses or individuals, producers involved. So, want to look at forming a steering committee. Be a similar step of with a nonprofit, and I'll talk about that in a second. But some of the benefits of a cooperative is that it allows multiple members, multiple individuals, multiple businesses to come together for mutual ownership and coordination. So what that helps to allow is that, if you're a single rancher, maybe you're running 100 head or 50 head, and you're trying to look at doing a finished product. You may only have, you're going to have a limited number of animals and a limited amount of product that's going to be available, versus if you've got 5 or 10 producers coming together, all of a sudden you have a larger quantity of product. So one of the examples in a non-tribal context, I'm based in Great Lakes region. I live in Wisconsin, and we've got a few great examples of cooperatives here. One of them, it is called the Fifth Season Cooperative, and started off in Southwest Wisconsin. There's actually one of the larger hospitals was wanting to buy vegetables, and they want to buy local vegetables, and they had a challenge of, it was difficult for them with their just basic insurance and their processes for working with vendors to go to each individual farm to buy a little bit of tomatoes from 10 different farms. Was just too much coordination. It was too difficult for them to be able to make that work. So that provided the inspiration and the catalyst for multiple producers coming together and formed the Fifth Season Cooperative. That when you've got that, that 10 or 50 different producers working together, then all of a sudden you've got a larger quantity of product, and it's a lot easier then to be able to get it into that big institutional client, with not just with the hospitals, but then it's expanded to other markets as well. The interesting thing with Fifth Season Cooperative is that it's not just producers, but they've got distributors, value-added processors, customers, all are eligible to be members of that cooperative. So that's what's called a multi-stakeholder cooperative. But in general, one of the principles for cooperative development is that every member has an equal vote within that within the organization. In terms of how most cooperatives work, and from a business standpoint, is that typically you would be paid based on the product that you're selling, that you are contributing to the cooperative. And then you also would get paid, if there is a profit, that you would get paid as a percentage of what product that you put in. Now that's going to vary from cooperative to cooperative, but that's the basic idea of how they work. One of the other huge benefits of cooperatives is that it improves the ability to raise capital. Most cooperatives are structured of that to become a member, you would buy in with a member share, And then most cooperatives have also then capital shares that they can sell those shares to help to raise funding for operations or for infrastructure. A couple of other examples of cooperatives from the Wisconsin area, but one of them that's gone national is Organic Valley. Organic Valley also started in a similar location in Southwest Wisconsin back in the 1980s when small family-owned dairy farms were going out of business. And at that point, really from that point till now, basically it's either go specialty, going organic, getting a higher price for your product, or go huge and running hundreds or thousands of animals. Well, it's difficult for a family-owned dairy farm at 50 or 100 animals to be able to have a market, to be able to get a high enough sales price points to survive. So multiple of families and operations coming together, that allowed pooling resources, pooling product, developing processing facilities, and having a larger quantity of product that now you go into Albertsons and Cut Bank, Montana, and you're gonna see Organic Valley milk and dairy products. So that's another example of where multiple producers coming together, that they were able to not only have the product, but be able also to have enough capital and financial resources to be able to operate both the processing and the distribution chains. So, so cooperatives, I think, are an interesting model. We do have a couple of formal cooperatives operating in Indian country, and we've got a lot of examples of cooperative strategies. So this is one that we're having discussions in Great Lakes region right now of how can we be doing more with these type of strategies to be able to, for instance, meet the need of with the food distribution program. And there's some new authority and new funding coming down the line for tribes to buy directly. And part of the challenge is, where do you go to buy that level of product, and how do you coordinate across across multiple different tribes? So I missed a slide there. Corporations. Just going to touch very briefly on corporations, because there's different types, and you may see these different types and wondering, what's a C corp versus an S corp, nonprofits. Well, very basically, a C corp is what you're going to see with the big companies, publicly traded. C corps, really designed that you can be national, international. You can sell shares. So most publicly traded companies are all C corps. An S corp is more of a simplified version of a corporation for less than 100 shareholders, and they all need to be U.S. based. B corp is a new approach that's really combining more of a nonprofit purpose with for-profit operations. So taking more of that business approach to addressing social need, which then moves to nonprofit, is a corporation that generally without stock, intended for public benefit and not for benefiting specific individuals. So I'm going to move toward wrapping up in the next few minutes here. But to go into a little bit more detail on a nonprofit corporation, of course, your major benefit is tax exemption. Now, it's important to recognize, just because you're a nonprofit doesn't necessarily mean that you're exempt from all taxes. There's still different employment taxes. Depending on how you're structured, what you're doing, you may have other tax liability as well. But generally speaking, nonprofits are tax exempt if you have that tax determination from the IRS. So this is one of the big takeaway points that I want to emphasize today, is how you would form a nonprofit corporation. And this really is insights into all these other models. The first thing that you do is that you need to incorporate with a state or a tribe. And even before you get to that point, you want to come together and think of what's your vision, and really starting with a group of incorporators that, they're going to be the signatories of, of signing those documents that would be submitted to a state or to a tribe. And then they would be your first board of directors. And then the next step is then you would file a form. It's called a Form 1023 that you would file with the IRS. And the Internal Revenue Service at the federal level is then looking at that application and would be determining whether you indeed meet the requirements to be a nonprofit, and they would give you then your determination letter. So I know that sometimes can be confusing, of that people will say, well, we're incorporating with the IRS. No, you're going to incorporate with your local jurisdiction and then file for your tax status with the IRS. And there's some there's the 501c3 is what most people are familiar with, but there's a 501c4s and 5s, and that's where this gets complicated, and happy to talk more with people if you have any more of those detailed questions. The other thing I want to emphasize is that nonprofits can generate income. That gets complicated. So of course you always want to consult with your tax and legal professionals. But I know I'm working with a couple of different nonprofits, and they're looking at how can they use their operations to both fulfill their mission, but have some income coming in, so that they're not completely reliant on grant funds year in and year out. But that does get complicated. And if you have a business that is not directly related to what you're doing, then typically you would have taxation there. Example is that a lot of hospitals will have pharmacies, and so those pharmacies, oftentimes the income from them will be taxed. But this is, that gets beyond the scope of today's presentation. But I did want to emphasize that nonprofits can generate income. It just can't go to enriching any particular individual. So where do you go for more resources? Small Business Administration has some great resources available. Contact your local community development financial institution. I just was on one of the last panels in the policy track, and we had AIPRA is the CDFI that IAC helped to form, Forban's on there as well. Most of the CDFIs are going to have support for developing a business plan. And then, it's always, I find, sort of difficult going to the IRS website, because it's kind of hard to find information on there. But ultimately, at the end of the day, the IRS is going to be the one that's going to be making the decisions. And so understanding what their guidance documents are, and they put out publications, that's going to be generally the most definitive source of information. And I did put a link on here of where you can go to, of where the IRS goes into a little bit more detail on these different forms of business organization. And they have links to additional information on publications. And but that's part of why there are attorneys and accountants that help to navigate some of those questions. Another document that I would point people to is the Tribal Business Structure Handbook. A lot of the focus on that is more looking at tribal businesses and tribes as businesses, but there is some good additional information in that guide. And then, of course, always feel free to contact Intertribal Ag Council. My email is dan@indianag.org. We can help to provide some assistance and guide you to other resources, but just keep in mind that you're probably at some point going to want to consult with an attorney or a tax professional. So that
Dan?
is
Dan?
Yep.
This is your facilitator, Electa. I just had one question as you were talking. And this is general business information, and I appreciate what you've shared. Tribal or family cooperatives, maybe, that they don't have their own license as a business, but they do have a fiscal sponsor. So do you know anything about what that fiscal sponsorship means in the structure of a nonprofit, or what have you seen that would either help make that decision to seek out a fiscal sponsor outside of your organization or to do it on your own over time?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think that it's going to really come down to the details of of any particular situation, and it's probably going to really come down to the details of what is that funder, what are they willing to work with, what are they going to require for those funds, because one of the big reasons and big benefits of of being a nonprofit is eligibility for funding. And then the other big question is then if a nonprofit's going to be a fiscal sponsor, what requirements, what conditions are they going to have for that sponsorship? And that can get very complicated very quickly, but I think it's great to have more organizations out there that are willing to provide that fiscal sponsorship, because part of what it helps to do is it helps to give people kind of a step up and start to think about, okay, if you're going to go for that full incorporation yourself, what are some considerations that you want to think about as you're moving toward that point?
Thank you, Dan. That's a great answer, and I appreciate you attending to that one. I think now we're going to go ahead and shift over to Jim if we don't have any other questions.
Good afternoon. I am Jim Wabindato. I work for the Indian Land Tenure Foundation. Sorry, running a couple of things here at the same time. I am going to share with you today some of my experience building from what Dan has shared with you, and talk a little bit about transition planning for farms and ranches, concentrating most specifically on the land issues. I work for the Indian Land Tenure Foundation, and that is our primary expertise. I will go through the American Indian Probate Reform Act and how those activities have an influence on what you'll face as business owners in Indian country. So let me go ahead and get this started. As I mentioned, I work for the Indian Land Tenure Foundation. Our mission is to help restore to Indian ownership and management all lands within the original treaty reservation boundaries. I've worked for the foundation for almost 7 years now, and it has been a great experience working with folks like you and other landowners on the different tribal communities. As I mentioned, today, I'm hoping to share with you some of my knowledge about successful succession planning in Indian country. And I'll begin by talking about some of the definitions for navigating the laws that control your land and will have an impact on your business. Specifically, when you're looking at operating your business, land tenure and the accompanying jurisdiction will have a great influence on who is in charge, what are the regulations that you'll need to comply with, if any, and how those processes, again, will have a long-term impact on your business. Specifically, we're looking at the tribe, where you may be enrolled or where your operation is taking place. The Bureau of Indian Affairs is the federal authority, and there is federal land. The allotment landowner is individuals who own own Indian land according to the federal government. There may be tribal members who will, as landowners, be able to have an impact on some of the leasing activities. Non-Indians are going to be part of this process, especially when you're looking at state, county, town, and city jurisdictions. All of them are going to have an influence on what kinds of decisions you will need to make as an operation, and then also successfully transitioning that to the next generation, whether it be in family or through sale. the land in your business and leasing options, again, where is your land located? Because the type of title that the land has, where it is located according to jurisdiction, all of those things, again, will set the legal framework that has an outsized influence on many of your business decisions. And again, as we look at the land that's involved in your farming operation or in your ranching operation, most of you are going to be leasing land, and it may be owned by the tribe, maybe owned by other individuals. And again, every piece of this will have an impact in the long run. So why do these questions matter? The financial and property risk involved when your business or leasing operation options depend on different types of land, because fractional title on the allotments increases the risk that it may be harder to lease. And once that land is difficult to lease, you've got idle operations. You'll have to find another place to put your cattle. You may have had plans for the next 3 seasons that are held off by a full year as that process goes through the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Implementation of certain USDA programs are explicitly dependent upon the title to the land. So even if you are using the land as part of your farming operation, you would not be able to participate unless you can show that you have exclusive access to that land, ideally through formal title to yourself and or to your business. But on occasion, if you're working with the USDA, you may well be able to use a long-term lease to establish that any improvements or actions that you're committing to participate in these USDA programs are covered for the duration of their involvement through your exclusive use of the land. And again, local politics. I think when you look at local politics on the reservation, it has one flavor, but the local politics on non-Indian communities is not very different, and how it operates and how it functions, but at the same time, you'll have a different set of elected officials making decisions based on how they see the matters. And again, because the Indian Land Tenure Foundation deals with land issues, I want to highlight that there are various forms of property in Indian country. It's kind of dry. It is important to understand how each of these influences activities. Fee land is registered with the state in which you reside, or more specifically, the land is registered with where the land is located, usually with the county as a subdivision or subdivision of the state. There is restricted fee land. This is land that is Indian land, according to the federal government, administered to an extent by the Department of Interior, but those restrictions are going to allow the land to look a lot like the regular fee land that is used outside of the tribal community. But with those restrictions, it does most specifically restrict who can inherit and use those lands according to the jurisdiction. So some things might be presided over by the state, other issues may be presided over by the tribe. And finally, most of what we think of are the trust lands. These are Indian tribes and individual Indians who have beneficial use of the land. I do put in here that title remains in trust and in the name of the United States government. And that is most specifically why all of our Indian land transactions go through the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Specifically under trust land, there is tribal land that is in the name of the tribe. There's public domain lands, and then there are assignments. Public domain does not usually have a specific tribe presiding over that land, and so it's a very difficult piece of property to work with. Assignments usually feel and operate a lot like individually owned land, but by legal title, they go through the tribe to the United States government, and the tribe does ultimately have final say on what happens with those lands. Next, I'd like to turn to the American Indian Probate Reform Act. Because we are talking about succession planning, in Indian country, there is a primary probate law called the American Indian Probate Reform Act. It was passed in 2004 and has been in effect for all Indian probates of trust assets on the allotments since June of 2006. Because of the way the law was written, it does strongly encourage that you write a will. And specifically, if you do not make a will, then AIPRA is set up to specifically create a roadmap on what will happen to your land. And a federal judge will, without family input, decide what happens. And again, because we're talking about operating businesses, this process, important to know, is something that will usually take anywhere from 2 to 4 years. The Indian Land Tenure Foundation is doing a survey with Indian landowners to see if we can get their sense of how long things are taking. But based on historical evidence, if anything happens on a probate within the next 2 to 3 years, you're doing pretty normal. And again, for businesses, 2 to 3 years could kill what's going on. And so we strongly recommend that you understand the American Indian Probate Reform Act, unless you live in specific tribal jurisdictions. So there are 14 communities throughout Indian country that have their own tribal specific probate acts or probate codes. The difference is that a probate act was passed by Congress. And so we can see the first was with the Klamath Reservation in 1938, and that continues through the 5 tribes in Oklahoma, including some of their affiliated tribal towns, as well as the United Kituwa Band of Cherokee. The Yakima, Warm Springs, Nez Perce, and Umatilla reservations in the Pacific Northwest have their own probate acts. It continues through to the Osage Nation, and then several Lakota communities. I do use the term probate code to delineate and define it under the American Indian Probate Reform Act, which created a pathway for tribes to unilaterally create their own probate code to address trust assets that is ultimately signed off on by the Secretary of Interior and is the specific roadmap in these tribal communities that a administrative law judge will use during probate hearings. When I talk about the American Indian Probate Reform Act, 2 concepts that come up quite regularly and will have a strong impact on what happens with your business is tenancy in common and joint tenancy with right of survivorship, or as I refer to it, the last Indian standing. For the most part, Indian land has been and continues to go through tenants in common. Specifically, what that means is that when you have 5 children, each of those 5 children will get a 1/5 interest of whatever you owned, and that they will then be able to pass that along to their children. And as you can see in this graphic, using tenants in common, after about 6 generations, you can go from 1 allottee on an average of 3 all the way to 240/3. And with the Indian Land Tenure Foundation doing a lot in probate and land ownership with allottees, I think I've seen numbers that are like 248 over 16,500. So the fractional ownership can get quite small. Because of that, unless you write a will for your Indian land according to the American Indian Probate Reform Act and make sure that that will is accessible for the probate process, you are going to be looking at this judge using AIPRA to apply joint tenancy with right of survivorship. And in fact, you still need to make sure that if you want to share it equally with your kids, that you say that you give that to them as tenants in common. Again, otherwise the law will require the judge to use joint tenancy with right of survivorship. And as I said, last Indian standing means that with our original 5 kids, when the first one passes away, theirs disappears. So any kids or grandkids they may have are lost to owning your Indian land, and it goes to the next 4 kids, and eventually goes to 3, to 2. And when the last of the other children passes away, whoever is the last Indian standing will get all of your Indian land ownership interests. There are a couple of other issues as business owners that you need to be aware of. When you're dealing with land that is controlled by the state, fee land, that operates under common law, and that says that real property includes the surface, subsurface, airspace, any improvements attached to the land, and the legal rights of ownership that go with them. So when you put in a fence for your cattle ranch, when you build a barn to hold the equipment for your farm, all of that stuff under state law would generally be considered part of your real property, not the equipment, but the barn and the fence. Because of a change in the American Indian Probate Reform Act in 2008, they changed it to create a separate class of property. What they did is they took the buildings, they took the fences, they took all of those permanent improvements, things that were not really intended to be removed, and classified them as non-trust assets. And as non-trust assets, they're not beholden to the federal government. They are not addressed through probate under the American Indian Probate Reform Act. And again, when you're looking at your business operation, the Indian land underneath it will go through the federal probate. Everything else will go through the state. And so your equipment and your buildings are all going to be subject to state jurisdiction. So when you're looking at succession planning and estate planning for your business operation, you do have to be fully aware of what's going to happen under both the federal system, the tribal systems as they exist, and then also the state system. Because of these difficulties that landowners and business owners have in Indian country, the Indian Land Tenure Foundation has been working on creating ways for these corporations, for the business entities to have a much stronger role in the ownership and management of Indian land, similar to what you would experience on your fee land or your non-Indian neighbor who may be operating a farm right across the street from you and is able to freely exchange everything to have the corporation actually own the land. The Indian Land Tenure Foundation has a project going that we refer to as co-owner trusts, and there is a message runner that I'll reference in the resources that more fully explains how this program is envisioned to help support business entities in Indian country, especially farmers and ranchers. But this was one of the graphics that was put in place that allows multiple landowners on these fractional owners on these allotments to work together through something as low in complexity as power of attorney, and continuing all the way through to corporations that you might charter under tribal law. And we're looking at seeing how we can create additional federally recognized corporate entities that individual Indians can use. But most folks, if they're deeply entrenched in corporate and tribal ownership, may have heard of Section 17s. Section 17 economic development entities are specific to tribal communities as a whole, but we're seeing how we can introduce, again, the federal charter that might allow for you as an individual to have your Indian land owned by the corporation and sidestep some of the probate issues and transfer your corporation to your heirs. The last piece I have that I want to make sure that we talk about is to assemble your transition team. When we're looking at Indian land exclusively, I mean, you can get away with a good attorney who can help you put together a will, an estate plan that addresses some of the other aspects of your health and welfare. But ultimately, as a business owner, you're also going to need to exclusively look at what other activities are involved in transferring from you to a spouse, from you to your kids, or also perhaps setting up some benchmarks or milestones for yourself that would trigger ways for you to perhaps sell the business and transfer it over time. So again, some of the individuals that may already be a part of your business operations, like attorneys, insurance agents, I made sure to add the Bureau of Indian Affairs Realty because of Indian land that may be involved in this process. And in wrapping up, I want to highlight how important it is to write a will when you have trust assets, how critical it is to address estate planning for your business. Most of us don't want to think that anything bad will happen, and we've still got a lot to do, but that isn't the way that life necessarily works. And so at the foundation, we want to make sure that the resources are available, that the knowledge is out there that help you make better decisions that meet your needs, because my needs and your needs and Dan's needs are not always going to be different. But the resources should still be consistent that allow you to be successful. And in fact, when you're looking at Indian land, sometimes advanced planning and transfers allow you to do something as simple as a transfer through a gift deed to the child that you anticipate taking over the farming business, and to withhold the use of that land through a life estate. I didn't put this in here explicitly, but with a life estate, you could transfer the land to who you want to have after you pass on, and legally it becomes their property. So unfortunately, you would not be able to undo it, but once it's transferred to them, your life estate allows you to continue your business operation until such time as you cease to, or until cease operations, or until you should pass on. But that life estate is not transferable. Only the original land transfer was available to you. And so just like with when you're looking at estate taxes, when you're looking at other activities under general state and federal law, under Indian law, under the Bureau of Indian Affairs process, again, there are some tools that exist that will allow you to ensure an orderly transition from you to that next generation. In conclusion, I did want to highlight that the Indian Land Tenure Foundation does plain language publications. They address specific issues, so they don't necessarily come out at special times. But I would find that it is good for you to realize that the American Indian Probate Reform Act is what we refer to as Message Runner 2. Cutting through the red tape helps to understand the various forms under land ownership and land management. Message Runner 9 is co-owner management. Again, that shares with you ideas on how the Indian Land Tenure Foundation believes that we can better address fractional ownership, and at some point may also help to bring forward additional ways. Unfortunately, it changed color on me when I moved the file. I have a website to the Iowa State Extension. It is a resource that is free. So for a lot of our there we go. For a lot of our do-it-yourselfers, it is a way for you to collect information. So I brought this up, extension.iastate or iowastate.edu. They have this ag decision maker. So I brought up the page specific to whole farms, transition and estate planning. Oh, looks like you're on the, let me see how I can do this. I think I might have to stop share and then reshare. Here we go. It's not showing yet.
We can see.
You're also welcome to type it into the chat if you want to. That way it'll be reserved on the recording. Just if you want to put a reference there in the chat for us,
Okay.
that would be fine.
Okay.
And it looks like we're down to about our last 5 minutes. So as far as questions go, we might open up the floor.
Okay. As I've switched back and forth, one last piece I'll share is that the federally recognized tribal extension programs, as well as the standard extension administered through your land grant college and available in almost every county in the United States, are great resources, and especially specifically the Intertribal Agriculture Council has a lot of other technical assistance providers who can help you with activities to address your needs as a business operator. Well, I do thank you for your time this afternoon, and look forward to any questions you might have.
Thank you for sharing that resource in the chat box. And we have Elise, she's helping us moderate questions in the background. So if one pops up, we'll ask you. But we really just want to thank you for educating us today on business basics, succession planning, and for sharing your knowledge on the IRS tax structure as it pertains to Indian Ag. Thank you also for sharing resources on the Indian Land Tenure Foundation and planning tools that we have access to, and also mentioning the message runner. That's going to be a real helpful resource. It looks like we have no questions at this point. So in wrapping up, I would just like to say a big thank you to all the sponsors of the IAC conference. That includes that this session is sponsored by our Champions of Native Agriculture sponsors. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Dan.